Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of ATP. Ask the Pastor. Pastor Sullivan here, Holy Cross Lutheran Church, Kerrville, Texas. Today's question. Dear Pastor, there is some dispute as to the true authorship of Hebrews. Some say Paul was the earthly composer of Hebrews. Others dispute this for various reasons, similar to those surrounding the long ending of Mark. Both Philemon and Hebrews seem like they can be placed into the Antilegomena category. Who did the Spirit inspire to write these two books? And if books are disputed, how did the ones you mentioned, as well as these I mentioned here, make it into the 39 canonical books of the New Testament? Would you consider them, or at least Hebrews, to be New Testament apocryphal writings that were of enough substance to get into the canon? All right, so there's never been any serious doubt that St. Paul wrote the epistle to Philemon. That wasn't disputed in the early church, and if anyone today disputes Philemon's Pauline authorship of Philemon, there's really no grounds for it. Now, Hebrews, on the other hand, has a really interesting history when it comes to authorship. The Eastern Church has always held that St. Paul wrote the epistle to the Hebrews. Eusebius of Caesarea writes in Book 3 of his ecclesiastical history. Paul's 14 epistles are well known and undisputed. It is not indeed right to overlook the fact that some have rejected the epistle to the Hebrews, saying that it is disputed by the Church of Rome on the ground that it was not written by Paul. That's Book 3, Chapter 3, Paragraph 5 of ecclesiastical history. So Eusebius is testifying to the fact that the East has always accepted the epistle of Hebrews as Pauline, but in the West, its Pauline authorship has been disputed. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, later in Book 6 of Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, he quotes Clement of Alexandria as a witness to Pauline authorship. He writes, Clement says, he says that the epistle to the Hebrews is the work of Paul, and that it was written to the Hebrews in the Hebrew language, but that Luke translated it carefully and published it for the Greeks, and hence the same style of expression is found in this epistle as in the Acts. But he says that the words, Paul the Apostle, were probably not prefixed because in sending it to the Hebrews, who were prejudiced and suspicious of him, he wisely did not wish to repel them at the beginning by giving his name. Farther on, Clement says, but now, as the blessed presbyter said, since the Lord, being the apostle of the Almighty, was sent to the Hebrews, Paul is sent to the Gentiles, on account of his modesty, did not subscribe himself an apostle to the Hebrews, through respect for the Lord, and because, being a herald and apostle of the Gentiles, he wrote to the Hebrews out of his superabundance. That's Book 6, Chapter 14, paragraphs 2 through 4. So Clement of Alexandria thought that Paul wrote the epistle, however, that he wrote it in Hebrew, not in Greek, and then Luke translated it from the Hebrew original into Greek, which would explain why the Greek of the Epistle to the Hebrews is much more polished and refined than that of St. Paul's other epistles. He also notes then that the apostle didn't include his name at the beginning of the epistle, as he customarily did, because he didn't want to offend the Hebrews who were suspicious of him. He didn't want to repel the Hebrews from receiving it. And then also he adds another reason of the fact that Peter was called to be the apostle to the Jews, while Paul was specifically called to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Now, Eusebius also cites the words of Origen of Alexandria in favor of Pauline authorship. Origen writes, moreover, that the thoughts of the epistle are admirable, and not inferior to the acknowledged apostolic writings, anyone who carefully examines the apostolic text will admit. Farther on, he adds, if I gave my opinion, I should say that the thoughts are those of the apostle, but the diction and phraseology are those of someone who remembered the apostolic teachings and wrote down at his leisure what had been said by his teacher. Therefore, if any church holds that this epistle is by Paul, let it be commended for this. For not without reason have the ancients handed it down as Paul's. But who wrote the epistle, in truth, God knows. The statement of some who have gone before us that it is Clement, the bishop of the Romans, that wrote the epistle, and of others that Luke, the author of the Gospel, and the Acts wrote it. But let this suffice on these matters. That's Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, again, Book 6, Chapter 25, 12 through 14. So Origen admits that the language and the style of Hebrews is very different from the language and style of Paul's other epistles. So it's possible that one of Paul's associates wrote it. He also says that Clement of Rome could have written the epistle. Clement of Rome wrote 1 Clement, probably around 97, 98 AD. And the reason that some people think that Clement wrote it is because 1 Clement 36, verses 2 through 5, very closely resembles several verses from the first chapter of Hebrews. Now, all that demonstrates, in my opinion, is that Clement of Rome was familiar with the epistle to the Hebrews. Familiarity, or rather similarity in a few verses, doesn't mean necessarily that it's the same author that wrote both of them. Overall, Origen takes a cautious approach. It's received as Pauline, but in reality, only God knows. Now, another Eastern Church witness to Pauline authorship is P46, a papyrus which is usually dated from anywhere between 175 and 250 AD. And this papyrus contains most of Paul's epistles, and it places the epistle to Hebrews in the second position immediately following the epistle to the Roman church. Now, while Pauline authorship was never really disputed in the East, it was a whole different story in the Western church. The Muratorian canon, Irenaeus of Lyon, and Hippolytus of Rome all agree that Paul wasn't the author of the epistle. Cyprian of Carthage, Lactantius, and Arnobius never quote from it. Tertullian, in all of his writings, mentions it only once. In chapter 20 of his work on modesty, he suggests that Barnabas is the author. That would be due to the fact that Barnabas was a Levite who was taught by the apostles himself, and so he would have been familiar with the law and with temple worship, the big things, the big topics of the epistle. Barnabas wasn't an apostle, of course, but he would have qualified to be what Tertullian calls apostolic men. He uses that term when he's defending Mark and Luke's gospel against Marcion. So Jerome mentions several times in his writings that the Latin church doesn't accept the epistle to the Hebrews, though he himself accepted Pauline authorship of the epistle. So agreeing with Jerome in the West are Augustine, Hilary of Poitiers, and Ambrose of Milan. Even at the time of the Reformation, so we're fast forwarding all the way to the 16th century, even at the time of the Reformation, the Western Church was still uncertain about the authorship of Hebrews. Cardinal Cajetan of Reformation fame, he didn't think Paul wrote it. Luther didn't think Paul wrote the epistle based on chapter 2, verse 3. The author says that salvation was at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him, who would be the apostles. Luther contrasts that verse with Galatians 1, verse 1, where Paul testifies that the gospel isn't from man nor through men, but that his gospel is from God himself. Now, Luther was the first, as far as I know, to suggest that Apollos was the author of Hebrews. In Acts 18, 24 to 25, Luke tells us that Apollos was a Jew born in Alexandria who was eloquent and mighty in the scriptures. So that would explain the author's intimate knowledge of the law and temple worship. Now, Luther's suggestion is clearly a possibility, just as Tertullian's suggestion of Barnabas, also a possibility. After Luther, later Lutherans were divided on whether Paul or not was the author as well. Johann Gerhard was one Lutheran theologian who thought the epistle was written by St. Paul. Gerhard cites Hebrews 13:23, which mentions our brother Timothy, whom the author would send to them soon. The author mentions his chains in 10:33, something Paul did often in his prison epistles. He also notes that the epistles share 9 axioms with Paul's epistles. He says that 2 Peter 3:15 is a witness to Pauline authorship because in 2 Peter 3:15, Peter says that Paul had written already to the Jewish dispersion. Peter's statement in 2 Peter 3:16 that some of Paul's things are hard to understand, that could be referring to the statements in chapter 6 and chapter 10 that some people, including Luther himself, at one point found difficult about Hebrews. Finally, Gerhard notes that the epistle ends with a similar subscript as 2 Thessalonians. So Gerhard concludes this: therefore we show our agreement with this latter position and claim that the epistle to the Hebrews is 1. a letter of Paul himself, 2. canonical, but of the second rank, because some people in the church had doubts about it, Antilegomena, a disputed book, and 3. written in Greek. So, Who wrote the book of Hebrews? My opinion is that St. Paul wrote it. I think Gerhard's arguments for Pauline authorship are convincing. Now, that being said, if someone thinks that it was Barnabas or Apollos, those are still apostolic men associated with the apostles, so the book's canonicity wouldn't be in any sort of danger. Now, while I believe that Paul wrote the epistle, Origen's judgment remains true. That it wasn't without reason that the book has been handed down as St. Paul's, but, as he said, who wrote the epistle in truth? God knows. Thanks for the question. We'll catch you next time on ATP Ask the Pastor.